I've only just met our first speaker, Kevin White, at this conference. He is behaved so far as perhaps the quietest and most unassuming of our keynote speakers. He just arrived. We didn't know he was here until he was here, and there he was, and he's been absolutely wonderful. Kevin is Mohawk. He was the director of the Native Affairs and American Studies program at SUNY University in Oswego. But he's just moved jobs, and he's now an assistant professor in the Department of Religion and Indigenous Studies at the University of Toronto. As a Mohawk, he straddles the Canadian-US border, which he tells me makes things quite complicated sometimes. He's very interested in Indigenous epistemologies, and in particular in the Haudenosaunee creation myths. So I'm very much looking forward to his presentation. Please welcome Kevin White.
Kia ora, and for my territory, Segos Ganagoa. We are going to have to do a little double duty here. I'll be delivering a paper, and you'll be watching other information that I can't fit into the paper in the 30 minutes allowed. So I wish to give greetings and acknowledgement and thanks to the Maori people, to the hosts, Annie and Philip in particular, and to Aotearoa for hosting this gathering, and I apologize for massacring the language. Engaging in Enraging the Anthropocene for me was born out of work I began a couple years ago with Kyle White, Lisa Sidaris, and others at meetings through a project funded by the Humanities Without Walls Consortium, based at the Illinois Program for Research in the Humanities at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. It was a collaborative effort with Michigan State, Notre Dame, University of Indiana, Bloomington, and many others in 2018 titled Being Human in the Age of Humans, Perspectives from Religion and Ethics, funded by the Humanity Without Walls. The work I presented at those gatherings centered on grappling with the Anthropocene through the lens of Haudenosaunee cosmologies and epistemological frameworks. The Anthropocene is a conceptual framework that appeared in 2000. Dr. Paul Crutzen and Eugene Stromer are attributed as the founders of this idea and framework for this discussion. In essence, the Anthropocene grapples with a shift in geological thinking, particularly among scientists, philosophers, and religious studies scholars about humanity's role and placement within the natural world. The Anthropocene is grappling with man's impact or ability to change the natural world on a grand and even a shocking scale. Even more fundamental to this discussion is this idea that an active participant in the natural world's outcome, shaping, and even viability. There are some contemplation of man no longer being an observer of nature, but willfully and deliberately shaping the world around and the earth around humankind's needs, desires, and perhaps most disturbingly, for economic gain and profit. But then what is being good-minded from a Haudenosaunee perspective while engaging and enraging the Anthropocene? What I find intriguing is the tension in the Anthropocene about man's role within the natural world, particularly from a Western religious or philosophical positioning. Originally, I intended to explore the tensions that existed between indigenous thought and Western thought by careful and close examination of the cosmological narratives of Genesis and the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois. I previously thought about how attempting to understand the examination of words like dominion, stewardship, and the like were key to understanding the cultural clash between Haudenosaunee and Western thoughts on the origin of the natural world, humankind's role within the natural world that have largely existed now for well over 500 years. I had hoped to argue that the fundamental clash between the West and Haudenosaunee peoples and cultures stemmed from conflicting views of the world as a gift versus the world as punishment. And while I believe that this argument still has merit, the keener interest stems from what the Haudenosaunee cosmological narrative and notions of the good-mindedness can tell us in the age of the Anthropocene. To begin with, from my perspective as a scholar and indigenous person based upon the cosmological narratives, humans have always been in the Anthropocene based upon the narrative itself. To be clear, there is a clear argument delineated through the ages that the natural world was created first, and for the benefit of humans that were coming here to dwell. On a very basic level, the most basic understanding of this complex, layered, and nuanced narrative illuminates a basic evolutionary framework for all that came before humans. in order that humans might possess a contented or a good mind. In short, all that was created was deliberately created to aid humans in our existence. Let me begin with a brief summation of the Haudenosaunee Narrative of Creation. We as Haudenosaunee believe that there is a world above us, the sky world, that there were beings, perhaps forces of nature, that were more powerful than humans who dwelt there, in a similar fashion to how we live today on this earth. There are some occurrences in the sky world where an old guardian of the tree that gave off the light that illuminated the sky world desired to have a partner. But no one had passed his tests yet. Finally, a young woman called Mature Blossoms, who is instructed by the first one to cease breathing, and we interpret that to mean to die in the sky world, went to go and see this old guardian. Mature Blossoms was even told what those tests would be and how to win approval. She does this. She and the guardian come together and her life changes. In other words, she becomes pregnant. This unsettles the old guardian's mind, and what I believe is the first example of an unhealthy mind. And the community raises a lacrosse game and a feast in order to guess his dreams that he might become healthy or good-minded again. His dreams that will restore his mind are that he and his wife sit near the uprooted tree that gave off the light to the world and share a meal. So the community and Mature Blossoms fulfill his dream. But in the final moments of the epic portion of the narrative, Mature Blossoms exits the sky world through the chasm left by the tree that gave off the light to the sky world. Allow me to get all academic here for a moment. It will become more important later in this paper. In studying all of the published versions of this narrative, patterns were revealed, both within the story and, more importantly to me, how we remember and share the story. While the Haudenosaunee are noted for their verbatim skills in oratory practice, stories can, will, and do change over time. A prime example of this is Mature Blossom's exit through the hole left by the uprooted tree that now has 3 distinct variants. First, and remarkably consistent from about the 1700s through the 1960s, the old guardian forcibly ejects Mature Blossoms through the hole, almost violently. Somewhere in the post-1960s through the late 1980s, Mature Blossom's position and fall change. In a number of the versions, she is now the daughter of the guardian, and ever curious, gets too close to the hole and slips through the hole left by the uprooted tree. Beginning in the late 1980s on towards the present, a number of communities articulated an understanding where she has agency and chooses to jump through the hole left by the uprooted tree. Today, many communities understand that the sky world was in fact dying, that Mature Blossoms is a metaphor for birth, and as such, carries with her new seeds and a child that will transform the world she is coming to. For you see, as she begins to fall to this world we currently are in, it is a dark, water-covered world where only those who can adapt to and live in such environments dwell. But Mature Blossom's name and roles change for the first time within the story. Those that live in this water-covered world begin to call her Sky Woman. And some even say that she brings the light to this darkened world. So they begin to counsel together on how best to aid this woman who falls from the sky. Knowing that she is not of this world, they dispatch waterfowl to go and retrieve her by interlacing their wings so that they might soften her fall. The others begin to think about who might bear the world on their back. Finally, they ask the great turtle to bear the weight of the world. And the Haudenosaunee believe that today's natural world rests on the back of a giant or a great turtle. Knowing that this is not enough, the animals counsel together to get some mud or earth for Sky Woman that she might grow the food that she eats for herself. Some agree to dive for the mud that is at the bottom of the water-covered world. The beaver, the otter, and the tiny muskrat. In the end, only the tiny muskrat is successful in retrieving mud and earth for Sky Woman. When she steps on the turtle's back, she begins to dance. And the great turtle begins to grow in size. So today our Haudenosaunee women still do this dance to honor Sky Woman and those that made it possible for us to come here and dwell. You remember that I said she is with child. She gave birth to that child, a girl who like Mature Blossoms, grew rapidly or matured rapidly in this water-covered world. Soon, this child, called Gusts of Wind, has suitors. But Gusts of Wind continually seeks her mother's approval before consenting to any one of her suitors. Finally, one suitor is deemed acceptable, for Sky Woman had knowledge of him. So he, the Turtle Man, and Gusts of Wind marry. He visits that night, and only that night in the story, and lays 2 arrows across her abdomen or her belly, one tipped with flint and the other not. Turtle Man returns in the morning to retrieve the arrows and leaves, but reappears later in the story to the children that he and Gust of Winds have. She discovers her life has changed, and she is pregnant with male twins, whom will eventually be called Good-Minded and Flint. Good-Minded and Flint are born. Good-Minded is born the natural way, the way humans will come when they dwell here, but Flint exits his mother's side, killing her during their birth. So Gusts of Wind becomes the first death on Turtle's back, and she is laid to rest beneath the Earth's garden blanket. A point of note here, the first one to die in Skyworld was laid to rest in a great tree, up in a great tree. At this point in the narrative, though, Sky Woman is likely suffering from grief over her exit from Skyworld and all that she knew, the death of her daughter. She begins to favor the one twin over the other. She chooses Flint, and she casts Good-Minded away into the brush. But together, the twin boys create all that we know in the natural world today, including we humans. Good-Minded always had a way of referring to us humans as those that are coming here to dwell. The twins of creation act as a balancing of sorts. Good-Minded breathes life into earth, and birds fly from between his fingers. Flint attempts to create a bird, but instead creates a bat. Eventually, all of this physical world that we now know is created by both twins. One rules the day, the Good-Minded one, with help from his elder brother or uncle, the sun. The sun is the elder brother of mature blossoms. Flint rules the nighttime, or more precisely, Flint rules the time from when the elder brother passes his apex or highest point in the sky until the next morning. Good-Minded creates all the plants, all the animals, all the food crops, medicines, fish, birds, trees, and in short, all things for the humans who are coming to dwell. Finally, the twins create humans as well, now that they are finished with the world that rests on the back of a great turtle. The Good-Minded twin leaves this final instruction to humanity, to give greetings and acknowledgement and thanks for all things that were placed here before us, because it was designed and done so deliberately to aid us in our existence on the great turtle's back. The late Seneca scholar and mentor and my friend John Mohawk articulated in the introduction to his 2005 book on Haudenosaunee Creation that this story informs the readers why we are here and tells something about Haudenosaunee identity. Mohawk states clearly that the themes of this cosmological narrative include, quote, that one of the major themes of the narrative pointedly answers a central question about Haudenosaunee identity. Who are we? We are the people who carry on the tradition of ceremonials and thanksgiving. Why do we do these ceremonials? Because we recognize our great good fortune as receivers of the gifts of the giver of life. Those who composed this narrative did so to transmit this message to future generations, end quote. There are a few key takeaways in this quote. One, the ceremonials of Thanksgiving are based on the lunar cycle and living comfortably and bountifully within the natural cycle of the environment. A second prominent acknowledgement is humanity's great good fortune as receivers of the givers of the gift of life in this world. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the narrative is composed purposely to transmit this message to future generations. Oren Lyons once said in an interview with Bill Moyers that as long as there is one to sing, one to dance, one to speak, and one to listen, life will go on. And so life continues from the time of creation that was created by the twins. I should go one step further in my interpretation and suggest that this narrative also points out that humans were created last and in need of most assistance in their existence, potentially framing humans as the weakest of all creation, not the pinnacle of creation or in God's own image, unlike Western constructs. We needed the most help remembering our instructions to give greetings and acknowledgement for all of the natural world that surrounds us. Much of the creation process on the part of the Creator was done always bearing in mind how it might aid and help the humans who were coming to dwell on Turtle's back. This interpretation stands in stark contrast to predominantly Western religious, philosophical, and dare I say, scientific constructs. In the West, humanity is viewed as the pinnacle of creation, created in God's own image and given the duty, the right, and some might say the responsibility of dominion and stewardship over the earth. Now, given technological advantages, humans can manipulate and alter the earth on a geological scale, thus the Anthropocene. The key problematic word for me is over the earth. Combine this with the expulsion of humanity from a utopian world likened to paradise. Problems are compounded in this Western framework. If humanity must toil against the natural world as a form of punishment suggested in King James Bible, then how can humanity not be above the world? Rulers of the world, or as the Anthropocene appears to suggest, shapers and molders of the natural world, in charge of the planet to suit their own needs, desires, and frameworks. This is not to say that indigenous cultures do not shape the world. They do so, but in a far less aggressive and violent methodology and practice that mold the natural world to their needs. Indigenous people have shaped portions of the natural world for harvest time, for long winter months, for animals and planets and water and fish. All have equal rights to exist, to thrive, and to grow families and communities. Indigenous cultures, oral-based epistemological thinking and frameworks, too often are easily dismissed as mere stories and mythologies. But these narratives inform the ceremonies, the pragmatic practices of the people, and notions of reciprocity that indeed provide the blueprints and roadmaps of how to navigate the impending change humanity faces. Again, as John Mohawk noted in Pioneers in 2006 talk, that he thought humans would indeed survive the coming changes to the environment, and that indigenous people who have long held a reciprocal relationship were particularly adept in understanding the nuanced dependency humans ought to see they have with the natural world. That discussion in the Anthropocene often tends to minimize and neglect entirely. Spoiler alert, humans seem to forget our dependency on the natural world far too often and too easily, which is why the ceremonies in these narratives exist, to remind us of our obligations to each other and to the natural world. Mohawk scholar Dr. Amber Adams and I have discussed for a number of years now, over our mutual research in the Haudenosaunee cosmological narratives, a very intriguing argument that is appropriate and germane to this discussion. Amber has presented publicly a few times now on her analysis of Sky Woman's story, not only as one of recovery from grief so clearly outlined in Haudenosaunee Creation, but one of recovery from ecological disaster as well. My own thinking and research suggests that a thorough and detailed study of indigenous epistemology and collections of stories reveals patterns of ancient worldviews where humans lived in an ongoing and constantly renewing relationship with all of creation, further suggesting that humans and the natural world must have had ancient frameworks outlined in the stories of indigenous creation that serve as a continual reminder of the ongoing obligations, reciprocity, and the foundation for ceremonies and understanding that provides a way to engage and enrage the conversation on the Anthropocene. I was very intrigued by two different trajectories, though interconnected within the Anthropocene. First, that in today's world of mass consumption, marketing, and trade, food production tends to lead to life's destruction. Though I interpret this to mean corporate agriculture, be it plant-based or animal-based, which is largely driven only by profit, maximum yield, and altered seeds that are chemically resistant to the toxins deployed against them. What is the impact then of a small-scale farming and gardening operation on the environment, I wonder? What then becomes of our connection to our own foods that we've grown? Have we not formed a relationship with these plants, with the environment, and with all those that share our abundance? Surely we do not hoard all our food, do we? And there has been such an interesting argument about the economics of food sovereignty, sustainability, and security that needs to take place in the Anthropocene. In some ways, this too is modeled in Haudenosaunee Creation story as the good mind, but I'll try to come back to that a bit later. The second that I wholeheartedly agree with in the Anthropocene and anthropocentrism is humanity equaling supremacy over the natural world. Rather than seeing humanity as but a part of the natural world, this is key, and how I was originally trying to frame the Anthropocene in relation to the strict interpretation and analysis of language accepted at the time of contact for us in the 1600s with the King James Bible about dominion over the world. It is in fact underlying force of thinking that has negatively affected indigenous cultures, spiritualities, and the natural world throughout the earth and the West's process and policy of colonization. This outcome is still in process because most of the West sees the world as something to extract what they need from it, be it food, be it energy, be it valuable rare metals that drive the leaps forward in our technology. After all, the driving forces politically, legally, ethically, and culturally is not what is good for the people, what is good for the land, or good for the community. Rather, it is what is good for the profit margins, for the stockholders, and for the corporations. A case in point is that corporations in the United States are seen not only as stakeholders, but people with the freedom of speech expressed through the ability to donate to the political candidate of their choice. Add into this mixture the lobbying force and the power of corporations and profit-driven politics. Is it any wonder that only indigenous communities and select other groups in the world see the environment and the land as having equality and a right not only to exist but thrive as humans do in the age of the Anthropocene? But then who are the lobbyists and the protectors of the natural world, of the animals, the fish, the birds, the plants, and the water? Who has those reciprocals relationships with the natural world today? While I have not elaborated on what the good-mindedness is directly, I hope to do so now in the remaining moments of my presentation. For me, good-mindedness is not only exemplified in one twin, but the choices we make. From one perspective, I often articulate that the twins represent choice. Good-minded opted to make decisions on what was best for those which he was creating, including the plants, the trees, the medicines, the animals, the birds, and the food plants. Whereas Flint often only operated on what he thought his needs were, what his fears were, and the welfare and care of his grandmother, Sky Woman. But what then is this good-mindedness according to the Haudenosaunee culture, thinking, and communities? The good mind is one of contentment, of happiness. And the work of Tuscarora scholar John Napoleon Britton Hewitt that he did with Chief John Buck, Chief John Armstrong, and Seth Newhouse, the cosmological narratives articulate that the contented mind for the humans was the aspiration of the good-minded twin. Tuscarora artist and historian Rick Hill often notes in public presentations on the good mind. He states that these are the following aspects he sees as the good mind: honoring and respecting one another, or humans respecting one another, practicing compassion and kindness, being truthful and consistent, practicing encouragement, taking responsibility, being strengthening and supportive of one another, working together, self-reflection on actions and decisions made and taken. These are powerful and hard things to practice every single day, but they also strike several codes of conduct that are common across humanity, that are pragmatic in simply being good-minded. When we examine creation closely, we see the choices that we make have consequences, sometimes immediate and short in nature, and other times far-reaching and more impactful than we had anticipated in our choice. Rick Hill also likes to summarize the original instructions given to humans at the end of creation as a way of encouraging people to think about our thinking, our actions, and how we are intended to live with one another and the natural world. The original instructions from Rick's perspective are: love one another, we are all related. Depend on one another for the common good. Live in harmony with the earth and be thankful. And think of the future generations. Leave a positive legacy. These are important because our ancestors created mnemonic devices and tools to assist future generations in remembering these instructions every day. They're often called by us the Thanksgiving address. The address, translated to English, is often said to mean the words that come before all else. This address was to be done individually and in gatherings to remind us of the bounty of the gifts of the world that we live in. The Thanksgiving address gives greetings and acknowledgments to all of the natural world and is often highly individualized to each speaker and recitation of the address. In other words, no one version of it is ever repeated the exact same way. There is a general format in areas that are specifically addressed as follows. First, we give greetings and thanks to the people, and then to the earth, the waters, fish, the foods and medicines, including corns, beans, and squash, and the strawberry, to the animals, the deer, to the birds and the eagle, to the trees and the maple, to the winds, thunder, rain, sun, moon, stars, the four sacred beings, the enlightened teachers, and finally to the Creator himself. This portion could be the entirety of the talk, for it contains all of creation and reminds us to practice living with a good mind through its recitation and thinking. But there's another aspect of the address that I want to speak to in this moment. In every version I have ever heard, the speaker comes close to a moment near the end of the address. He or she asks publicly and acknowledges something important. The speaker asks that if she or he has forgotten anything, that those gathered remember it and send our greetings and acknowledgement to it, and states clearly forgetting was not their intention, but they had done the best in that moment that they could with the abilities they had. At once both an act of humility and of humanity. I believe this underscores the teachings above that are drawn out in creation, whereby we make choices every day. Sometimes those choices are good, and sometimes those choices have negative consequences and outcomes. But like the speaker acknowledges at the end of the address, we are to try to do our best with the abilities we have every day. And culturally speaking, there are social, political, and spiritual mechanisms in place to right any wrongs and choices we make, often provided the person is willing to acknowledge the issue publicly and correct the wrong. I will close with an old treaty belt that dates before the contact with Europeans among Native American or Indigenous nations in the northeastern peoples. It was a treaty belt that was between Indigenous nations with defined territories and unique cultural practices. It is called the Dish with One Spoon. In Turtle Island, we had this agreement between them over the resources of the natural world, and that there was this notion of reciprocity with the natural world and thus with each other. The agreement was called the Dish with One Spoon and is still remembered and embraced by many modern Indigenous communities and peoples. Again, Rick Hill has stated in recent talks, public talks, that there were only 3 rules to this agreement. 1, that the people only take what they need and are grateful for what they take. 2, that people leave something for the future generations yet unborn, because we are only borrowing from them. And finally, that we leave the dish clean. In other words, we take care of the dish. The dish is the metaphor for the natural world in this agreement, and it encompasses all of the natural world. In this agreement, Indigenous nations, communities, and peoples agreed to use this metaphor of the spoon. For to use a knife or fork might lead to accidental violence and bloodshed over resources. In short, the dish guaranteed that all peoples had an equal right to the dish, as did all parts of the natural world. The dish contained the trees, the berries, the animals, the birds, the fish, food plants, medicines. Those parts of the natural world are also dependent on the dish itself. So they too had rights to the dish. But from the dish, humans would only take what they needed. Finally, it was the responsibility of each generation to ensure that future generations had the same gifts as those generations before them enjoyed. Conflict would not arise over food sustainability, security, or sovereignty, which is why knives and forks were not allowed in the dish, only a spoon. This is using the good mind. It is also a treaty belt and living within the patterns of a constantly renewing world that humans have a reciprocal relationship with. In closing, I believe that there is no one version of this creation narrative that is authentic, accurate, or authoritative. Rather, together, they reflect how different generations retain core cultural values within the narrative, navigated their current ecological, political, and cultural issues, and bundled it all together for future generations. You'll notice that Haudenosaunee culture and epistemological knowledge draws heavily on metaphors and analogies. So what can the creation narrative teach us about being human in the age of humans? Well, I've shared with you but a brief, and I mean very brief, story of creation. I hope I have connected the dots for you on how the good mind extends out of the cosmological narratives of the Haudenosaunee and other indigenous epistemologies in an attempt to engage and enrage the Anthropocene. We find the good mind has a core cultural value and framework of Haudenosaunee thinking, experience, and culture. The cosmological narrative itself demonstrates how those forces created and shaped our natural world, and did so in order that we humans might have a contented and happy mind in life. All we need to do is extend greetings and acknowledgments to the world around us, we who enjoy the reciprocal relationship of the constantly renewing natural world of abundance, provided that we follow the dishes with one spoon's thinking. Only take what you need, leave something for future generations and others in the dish, and leave the dish clean. and perhaps most importantly at this gathering, that all the living things had equal rights to the dish as well. Dani no, thank you.